Now, Ted Fletcher, would you like to hit your feet? Ted, most of you know, he's been on his feet many times, probably more than anyone else at this group. His knowledge of West Australian history is vast, and I've had to lean on him many, many times. But Ted is going to talk about Frank Colquhoun, and for those of you that didn't know him, you really missed out. I went to his 100th birthday, so did Ted, went to the same function. But a couple of months later we got news that he'd miscalculated and it was really only his 99th birthday.
Frank's life has already been chronicled in several ways. He's had press interviews, a brilliant oration was devoted to his life, his well-known book, Cockpit and Spanner, which was his autobiography. He has a 10-hour oral history in the Batty Library. He's been a long-time member of the exclusive Early Bird Association, and for those of you who, I'm sure there's no one here who doesn't know what they are, but basically to belong to that you had to have been employed in aviation before the 2nd of September 1939, which means that even a 14-year-old boy joining then would be well over 80, getting towards his 90s now. So Frank was a very long-time member of that. He was a member of the Kimberley Association, the Civil Aviation Historical Association of WA, and Brian has just reminded us he was patron of the Airline Pilots Association. So Frank had plenty of contact with Fliers, plenty of contact with aviation. A lot of people assembled this week to bid him farewell up at Midland, and I think it's interesting to note that when Brian was talking about the stamps, that Frank was born the year before the first flight was made in Australia by John Hewden. He was born only 6 years after the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in America, and that is an incredible span for one man through from the string and wire and wood aircraft through to jet aircraft. Now Brian waylaid me last week, and I should have suspected something was up. He said that it was time the old Fliers group played a tribute to Frank as well. To everybody else that had a say, so it was about time we had a few words to say about him. And I agreed so enthusiastically that Brian said, "Good, you're going to give it." I fell into the trap nicely. But Brian's done a fantastic job on the graphics as always, so I think you'll find something of interest coming up. I do it very willingly, as Frank was a man for whom I had a tremendous respect. I was very fortunate in that the Batty Library asked me to do an oral history of Frank for the state records. They said keep it down to an hour to 2 hours because it costs a lot of money to transcribe the tapes into the written word. When I went back to them, I had 10 hours of tape. And they said, oh, no. They rang me up 3 weeks later and said, we can't cut it, it's fantastic, but we can't afford to have it transcribed. So, of course, I heard this voice saying, oh, I'll transcribe it for you for nothing. And I thought, my God, that was me. But it was a labour of love, because that 10 hours I spent with Frank opened my eyes to just exactly what he'd done. He told me a lot of things about the politics, the people, the events that happened behind the scenes, and it only enhanced my opinion of him as an absolute legend in the history of aviation in this state. So here's a quick glimpse of the man in action. Frank started work at Langley Park with Norman Brearley in 1923 at the age of 14. This was taken 2 years earlier, actually, when the service was just starting. UDI there in the foreground, of course, crashed on the first day. Shortest lived aircraft in West Australian history, actually. It was only about 2 weeks old. But Frank joined 2 years later, and he was the hangar boy, and general dog's body, sweeping the hangar out, making the morning tea, cleaning up all the mess on the floor. But it wasn't very long before Frank showed that he had an enormous enthusiasm and a considerable amount of manual skills. Some of the mechanics would drag him in on the jobs to help. You hold this, hand me up this. and within a year Frank was doing mechanical work. At the end of 1923, they moved to Maylands. They moved the hangar out from Langley Park, and at last they had a proper airfield. Proper in the sense that as long as it didn't rain, you could land there. If it did, you needed a seaplane, because it used to swamp and bog very, very easily. This was with a work-safe approved method of transport of taking the staff from Mount Lawley out to Maylands in the morning. Note the airbags, the safety belts. In some remarkable way they all got there. In fact, I think even the photographer then went and climbed on board too after he'd taken the photograph. But Frank remembers that truck with a great deal of reminiscence. Then, in 1926, down came the rain, and Maylands was rendered unusable for several weeks. They had to do an emergency landing ground up north of Midland. And I don't know what Frank's doing there. I think he told me he thought he was feeling for a spanner that he'd dropped on the floor with his feet. But several other people have made other suggestions. I won't go into it. This is a very interesting photograph because it illustrates perfectly the sort of person that Frank was. Everybody else is leaning on their brooms and smiling at the camera. Frank's still digging. He was a can-do boy. He didn't talk. He was one of the real engineers who don't talk but do things. And I think that's great that he didn't even stop to have his photograph taken. He said that was a terrible time. Dead animals were floating down in the flood, and every drain was clogged, and they had an enormous amount of physical work ahead of them to get the airfield going again. By 1926 also, Frank was now beginning to work on aircraft. And this particular aircraft, GAUDZ, was a rebuild of the old one that crashed at Port Hedland, killing Keith McKay. And Frank is arrowed there in his cap. He loved that cap. But by now he was an indentured apprentice and hoping for a lifetime of work ahead of him, which was to certainly come true. The next year, he suddenly became a marine engineer. Norman Brewerly bought a speedboat, a thing called Zara, bought it from Charles Henriques. And Norman, who was very keen on winning things, in fact that was the only thing that was worthwhile competing for, was when you won. He said to Frank and Dave Colquhoun, who I think is, that's Dave there, and there's Frank in the bow. He said to Dave, rip that old car engine out of it and stick a Siddeley Puma in, 240 horsepower. Well, here Dave and Frank had a marvellous time trying to work out cooling systems, but they finally got the thing going, and it was taken down to the river, and Norman Brewerly proudly took with him his brother Stan and Hereward de Havilland, who was in Perth delivering the first of the moths that came over from England. Norman opened the throttle to really show them what the boat can do and promptly ripped the transom out. The boat capsized, Stan was trapped underneath, and all in all they had an entertaining afternoon. But they rebuilt it, and the next race, Norman wasn't able to be on board because he was doing an air show at Maylands, but it was a scratch boat, it was miles behind everybody else, but the boat really performed, and they won by an enormous distance. And Norman Brewerly was flying a moth in the air show, and he flew over the river to see how the boat was going, and Dave Colquhoun held up this big board with a 1 on it, got the thumbs up out of the cockpit. And as far as I can ascertain, Zara never sailed again. I think Norman realised that he had a tiger by the tail with that one. In 1929, Frank was sent to Broome as a resident engineer. Now, he was 20 years old, and he was taking over the responsibility of a whole depot at Broome. Broome was an important depot because the aircraft that came up from Perth in relays, from Geraldton to Carnarvon, Carnarvon to Port Hedland, Port Hedland to Broome, and then when it got to Broome it went on to Derby and then came back to Broome. So there was a lot of activity. Broome was an important terminal point. And Frank had just 2 helpers, and he did a great job in keeping the aircraft flying in very difficult conditions. these aircraft with their water-cooled Puma engines were never designed for the Australian climate. And water problems were a great difficulty. They had auxiliary tanks. They carried a lot of water on board and often had to just simply land to refill the radiators. It was a very difficult climatic exercise up there just to fly an aircraft. In 1928, Frank was pulled back to Perth to, or actually that should be 1921, 91 should be moved on a bit. Bert Hinkler had flown from England to Australia in record time in this avian, and he flew over to Perth to show the aircraft off, to meet the people, but also to meet his wife, who was coming back from England on one of the overseas mail boats. And Frank was given the job of pulling the auxiliary fuel tank out of the avian's front cockpit and reinstalling all the co-pilot's controls and the seats. And because Hinkler wanted to fly his wife back to Sydney with him. And that was the first contact that Frank had with a lot of famous aviators. Being so heavily connected with aviation engineering, and all the aircraft that came over here needed servicing, and Frank was rapidly becoming the person of choice to do this because he was so reliable and everybody trusted his work so much. The Southern Cross came over in 1928, and Charles Kingsford Smith showed his remarkable ability at navigation by mistaking Bunbury for Perth and getting about 5 miles out to sea before he realised that something had gone wrong. And he also forgot that Perth was 2 hours behind Sydney. And he told everyone that he was arriving at 9 a.m. And of course he arrived at 7 a.m. and there was nobody at the aerodrome to meet him. He was a bit miffed about that, but finally it was all straightened out. It was also raining heavily, and you can see from the wheel of the Southern Cross the mud that was being brought up, some of it on Frank and some of it on the aircraft. And in fact, Kingsford Smith was delayed at Maylands for a week, being unable to take off, and the only way he was able to get back to the Eastern States was by taking off with a very low fuel load and flying to Tamman, and then fueling the aircraft properly at Tamman and flying on to the Eastern States. He'd made the trip from America, of course, and by this stage Kingsford Smith had become a very famous man. In 1929, Frank was brought back from Broome again to help with the assembly of the DH-66 Hercules. Frank, I said, what were they like, Frank? He said, they had the greatest built-in headwind of any aircraft I've ever seen in my life. And he was absolutely right. They built 4. They didn't need 4. In actual fact, they got rid of 2 quite quickly. But they were very reliable. They had the Jupiter 6 engine in, which was a direct drive engine. And they were one of the most successful aircraft that WA Airways operated. When they got flying, and this is one of the first ones, that was the last one. That's doing a test flight. And normally it took 2 pilots, but really realised there were 2 things against that. Firstly, they didn't really need 2 pilots on a relatively short run between the various towns, and secondly, it cost money. And in fact, I should have put that round the other way in Brewery's order of priorities. And so he created the position of flight engineer, and Frank was immediately made the flight engineer. Jimmy Woods, who had a great relationship with Frank, decided this was a marvellous opportunity, and he taught Frank how to fly the Hercules straight and level, because Jimmy Woods loved talking to people back in the aircraft at the various stops. And when the Viastras came on service, this was even better because Jimmy could go back into the cabin and talk to all his mates, while Frank steadily flew the Viastra across the Nullarbor Plain. At one stage, an elderly lady who was a bit nervous clutched Jimmy Woods' coat and said, "Did you know that there was a boy flying this aircraft?" And Woods said, "Don't worry, madam, he's a much better pilot than I am." And that settled the matter once and for all. Back in Broome, he was moved up to Wyndham for a short time, and he helped Jim Mollison service the Cirrus Moth before his flying over to England for the record attempt. That's Jim Mollison there. Norman Brearley just behind him, and I don't know who the other two are. But refuelling was done by just lifting drum after drum, 4-gallon drum after 4-gallon drum of plume up onto the top wing and pouring it in. Aviation was a hard job in those days. There was a lot of hard physical work involved. Very little mechanical aids available. When Norman Brearley bought his last DH-50 in England, it was the one that Alan Cobham used on his record-breaking flights. And it came back to Australia complete with floats, as well as the normal landing gear. Well, Norman thought this was a great idea, and so he got Frank to work putting the floats on it. This is in the river, actually, behind the hangars at Maylands. And the aircraft was used in this form for special occasions. I think a couple of times it flew Father Christmas into Perth, much to the delight of the children. But I probably, apart from visiting aircraft from the eastern states, I think it was the first seaplane that ever operated in Western Australia. Then, in 1932, Frank got involved in the saga of Salt Lake City, the loss of, or the crash of the DH-50 flown by Harry Baker out in the Great Victoria Desert when he had Stuckey and Paddy Welland on board. They were looking for Lassiter's Lost Reef, and they suffered an engine failure and landed on a salt lake, got bogged, the aircraft turned upside down. I think you all know the story of this one, very well known, but Baker showed an amazing amount of skill and perspicacity by getting the thing going again, flying it back to Forest. And by this time, Norman Brearley had picked up Frank in Maylands and flown him out to Forest to help with the reconstruction of the aircraft. But they no sooner got there when the Vickers v Astra, which was on its way to Perth, came down at Xanthus with an engine failure. Now, this brought to light with Frank a very interesting experience. He said the engine failures on the Vickers v Astras were so common that they were known by us as the Vickers disasters. They had a Jupiter 11 engine, which was a geared engine, and they had an immense amount of problems with it. And Frank actually devised the most ingenious kit, called a plumbing kit, so that he could go out to this ground aircraft and he could put a Jupiter 6 in, and he had all the various plumbing to connect it up to the Jupiter 11 controls. It was a very, very ingenious idea. And so he was shot back to Xanthus to get that flying and came back to Forest, but unfortunately he just missed the celebration dinner that was held at Forest to celebrate the rescue of Baker and Welland from the Salt Lake. And the menu is rather nice, actually. It's all in aeronautical terms, and the hors d'oeuvres and nuts and bolts and screws and washers. But he never got to sign it, unfortunately, which was a shame. But there's some very famous names there: Harry Baker, Jimmy Woods, all the Royal Australian Air Force crews who flew the Wappities that took part in the search, and the resident people at Forest. It was an amazing achievement getting that aircraft back. And it always surprised me that Baker didn't get an Osborne gold medal for that. Then in 1932, Bertram and Klausman came out from Europe flying this Junkers, and they got in big strife. They got lost over Timor Sea, couldn't find Darwin, and finally landed on the northwest coast. And they were up there for 40 days until they were rescued by some of the native bushmen. They came back to Perth. Paul Klausman was in a bad way because Bertram, who was a very autocratic Hun, had given Klausman a very rough time in that 40 days, blamed him for everything. And Klausman was actually taken to the Heathcote Mental Hospital when they got back and never really recovered. But the thing then was, how are we going to get the aircraft back? Now, Klausman and Bertram had cut off one of the floats, chopped it in half, tried to make a canoe of it, which wasn't successful. And the canoe itself is now down in the Aviation Museum at Bull Creek. We want to go and have a look at it. It's quite interesting. So Brearley suggested that he sent Fred Sexton, who was one of their very fine engineers, up to the Kimberleys with a float off the DH-50. And this was generally done. Fred Sexton said that Bertram was terrified at the idea of trying to fly the thing, and he had to get quite hard with Bertram and tell him to get in the thing and fly it and stop messing about. So they flew back to Perth with this asymmetric float arrangement. It was brought ashore, they refitted a normal landing gear. Bertram flew it to Kalgoorlie, overshot the aerodrome and finished up in a pigsty, and generally had a rather hectic time getting back. And no one ever found out why he'd come. It was a great talking point in the aviation industry. And there was talk that he was going to China to sign some sort of a deal on behalf of the Nazi Party, or the embryo Nazi Party. But he was all he left in Perth as memories were a whole lot of unpaid tailors' bills, which the German consulate had to finally pick up. Wasn't very popular in Perth, but Frank did quite a lot of work there. The float, he constructed a kit to put that float on the Junkers without ever seeing the Junkers. He did it from a verbal description by Klausman in the mental hospital, and it fitted perfectly. Frank just had that ability to get right to the core of the problem straight away and just get it fixed. This is a Viastra in a very common place, force landed on the middle of the Nullarbor Plain, or thereabout. No, it's not the Nullarbor Plain, there's trees there. But that's the typical setup where we have a Jupiter 6 on one side and a Jupiter 11 on the other, and with the distressed engine strapped underneath. The geared engines were a total failure, and I think everybody breathed a sigh of relief when Harry Baker finally crashed the last Viastra at Redcliffe. And they said, "What about the insurance?" And Norman said, No, we'll claim the insurance. They didn't even think about trying to fix that thing. And it was sold for scrap in 1939. But it was a very interesting example, I think, of the way the British aircraft industry was going. The Americans already had worked out how you build a proper aeroplane. And the Brits decided that, you had a wing and a body and a couple of engines, and that's really all you needed. And what was all this talk about metal? Just couldn't believe it. And as a result, of course, because of the government's policy at the time, the Australian aviation industry was saddled with these rather incredible aircraft the British built at the time, before they could get hold of the really decent American aircraft. In 1934, Frank was stalled at WA Airways. His brother Dave was the chief engineer, but Dave took a job with Hollyman Airways in Tasmania. And while he was waiting to take the boat to Tasmania, he teamed up with Horry Miller in this new McRobertson Miller aviation company, which was opening up in Perth, because they'd won the contract to fly the mail from Perth to Daly Waters. And I think Ian Howell's going to talk a lot more about that. Dave said to Horry, "I've got a brother who's pretty good, and he's just about to be retrenched by WA Airways because they're in a heap of trouble. Can he take my job?" So Horry said, "Yes, by all means." So Frank, who had been retrenched by Norman Brearley because his airline was getting into all sorts of strife, he moved over to Horry Miller's show. Brearley's star had fallen. From a total of 15 aircraft, he was now down to one Dragon and one Dragon Rapide, and he only lasted another 2 years before he gave up and sold the whole show to Adelaide Airways. But Frank could see this coming, and he was very glad to get out of WA Airways. Once he got to Mac Miller, his career really took off, because he got on, at first after a rather tentative association with Horry, he got on very well with Horry because they were both very similar types of people. They were, let's get stuck into it. They were both like that. There was no talking, they just did it. Frank told me once that Horry saw one of the apprentices break 4 hacksaw blades in one morning and sacked him on the spot. That's the sort of perfection that he wanted in aircraft engineering. Horry trusted Frank tremendously, and as a result gave him a whole lot of jobs to do, which probably he wouldn't have let anyone else touch. The Dragon was used on this service up to daily waters. It was stretching the Dragon to its limits to do that work. But it was, in its day, it was a very successful aircraft, but it was the end of the line of that type of wood, string, wire and canvas aircraft. Unfortunately, the British didn't realise it. And they produced the BH-86. If Frank thought all his problems with the Astra's rover, he didn't realise what he was inheriting with the DH-86. It was an absolute dog. Had a high propensity to ground loop. It didn't have a lockable tail wheel. It had a built-in instability, which was quite fatal. In fact, 15 of these aircraft came to Australia. 5 of them crashed. 35 people were killed in them. And I often wonder what position Qantas would be in now if they had to admit that 1/3 of their fleet had crashed. The Brits made a dreadful cover-up of the whole thing. They knew perfectly well that the aircraft was faulty, but they did nothing about it. And it wasn't until some years later that they cured the problem by altering the wing routes and by putting zebra shield rudders on each side of the tail flame. But Frank hated them, and he spent a lot of time going up country to this sort of accident where somebody had ground looped the aircraft, wrecked the undercarriage, which meant the wings had to come off, and it must have cost Macmillan a lot of money to keep these aircraft in the air. And when they finally went in 1938, Frank breathed an enormous sigh of relief, because that's what they got, the Lockheed Electra. 2 of them came out to Parafield, assembled by Guinea Airways, and Jimmy Woods and Horry Miller went over to fly them both back to Perth. Horry took off and flew off to Perth perfectly satisfactory. Now Jim Woods was a very strange pilot. One thing that Jim was fascinated with was any knob or lever that didn't have a name on it, and he would pull it to see what happened. He didn't realise the one he just pulled was the undercarriage lock, and he immediately dropped the Electra on its belly before it even took to the air. It was one of the black marks that he incurred from Horry Miller, which eventually led to his being sacked. But Frank, who's in that position there, told me that, he said, I'm not inspecting the underside of the Electra, I'm kneeling, praying to Allah that someone does something about Jimmy Woods. Anyhow, they got the thing back on its wheels and they flew it to Perth. Jim, of course, finally got completely disoriented, taking off in mist and fog at Broome, and overrode the first officers flying and put the Electra into the marsh and wrecked it completely. And that's when he and Horry parted company, but that's another story. In 1942, one of the Electras was coming back from the northwest, had an engine failure at Napier Downs, and it came down in a creek bed. They couldn't get replacement aircraft, and Horry said to Frank, bring it back, just go up there and bring it back. Well, Frank went up and he spent a month in those sort of conditions. They jacked the aircraft up, they finally got it on dry land, they flew in a second a replacement engine, and that had to be flown in pieces in the little Cessna C-37 because they couldn't fit a full engine into the Cessna. And they assembled it in heavy rain under a makeshift tent. Frank said it was the worst month that he's ever spent in his life. The insects, the mosquitoes, the flies. He said it was misery. But they got it going, and came back to Perth, and that famous, that's how they hauled it from the creek bed over to the temporary airstrip to take off. It was a fantastic effort, probably, in my view, certainly the greatest piece of aircraft rescue that's ever been done in Australia. And then the DC-3s arrived. And I think Frank realised that a lot of his troubles were now over. At last he's got his hands on an aircraft which was a very fine piece of aeronautical engineering. I think you remember I had about 12 or so of them. Several of them came from overseas, and Frank had started making trips to New Zealand, to India, to help bring these aircraft back. By this time, he was in uniform, and he was a flight engineer, and they had a remarkable experience when they went up to the Philippines to get one. There were 4 of these aircraft standing in line, and they bought the one second from the right, which was a C-47A. And next to it was a C-47B, and the C-47B had a hydraulic undercarriage retract, whereas the C-47A had a most peculiar sort of semi-manual system with all sorts of bungee cords and things like that. Cyril Kleinig, who is there, decided to go off to Manila for the long weekend and do a bit of partying, and he left Frank out at the aerodrome at Clark Field, and Frank looked at the C-47B, borrowed some aircraft jacks from the United States Air Force, jacked up the C-47, took all the hydraulics out of it and put it back into the one they bought, and switched everything over. When they took off, Fliers said, "This aircraft's changed." And Frank said, "Yeah, I stuck all the hydraulics from the one next to it." Kleinig, who was a very upright man, said, "No, that's steering." He said, "Take it back, replace it, change it back the way it was." And Frank said, "Here's the Spanish, Cyril, you do it." Cyril decided he'd go on to Australia instead. And that was the sort of thing that Frank would do. And he did that completely unaided to make that changeover. Then the F-27s began to arrive, and Frank became very experienced on them. Here he is now in a collar and tie. The overalls have gone. These are all his apprentices around him, and I think that's Richard Vickery, who was the supply engineer, and I think that's Pat. Forget his name. He's the master of the apprentices. But by now, Frank was moving into the executive position, and he had very little to do with the F-28. I think one of them came out here on a demonstration tour at one stage, and Frank probably inspected it, but he by this time, it was well into the 60s, and he was never had any associations with the F-28. He started to get into the higher echelon stuff now. That's Frank with Alec Witham on the. So that's Alec Witham, and that's Sir Donald Anderson, the Director of Civil Aviation in Australia. I don't know who that central chap is. This is a monthly staff board meeting at MMA with people like Ted Karasek and Cyril Kleinig and several of the other people in aviation. There was this uneasy alliance at this stage between Airlines WA, who had been forcibly made to join MMA, and some of these meetings, Frank told me, were very, very tense and strained affairs where the old doctrines of each airline come into the fore. All this combined to make Frank feel that his time was really beginning to run out. And in 1969, when he was then 60, he was offered a job overseas, straightening out Royal Nepal Airlines, who got themselves into all sorts of maintenance problems. The Department of Foreign Affairs was running this Australian aid abroad scheme. And so Frank went to Nepal, and he spent 3 years in Nepal, sorting out their paperwork and getting their maintenance schedules on order. And then he went down to Malaysia, where somebody had several twin aviation pioneers. He bought them to bring back to Australia, and Frank serviced them all and got them all airworthy to fly to Australia. He was there for 2 years, and then he went to India, to one of the Indian airlines, and spent 5 years in India working there, straightening out some of their procedures. So he was away from Australia for 10 years, and he came back in 1979, and Ansett offered him, he was always really employed by them, they kept him on their staff, and they said, "All right, we'll put you back in a good position again, but you're going to have to move to Melbourne with your family and everything." And Frank said, "No, I've done enough." And so he hung up the spanner and elected to retire after 57 years of unbroken service to the aviation industry. A truly remarkable man. and we will never ever see the like of him again in the Australian aviation scene. They don't make them like that anymore. Thank you very much.